In February 1929, Trotsky arrived in Turkey on the island of Büyükada off the coast of Istanbul. His wife Natalia was with him, as well as his son, Leon Sedov. Trotsky thought that Stalin had exiled him to Turkey to isolate him even more and to render him powerless. He knew nobody in the country and didn't speak the language. But Trotsky wasn't too downhearted. By July 1929, he had created the Bulletin of the Opposition, in which he denounced Stalin's behavior and policies.
The paradox is that they exiled Trotsky or politically eliminated him, or so they believed. But from that point onwards and through the 1930s, Trotsky would continue his activities and would be a reference point, the only one to oppose Stalin and the power of the Russian state in such a way. He was exiled not just because he was an irritation, but also because he refused political compromises or to be silenced.
Trotsky tried to form an opposition, but from outside the USSR, he had much less chance of being heard than from within. Stalin, the little hoodlum from the Caucasus, to whom nobody paid any attention, became the uncontested master of the Soviet Union. He was given the nickname the Little Father of the People, an expression that hitherto had been reserved for the Tsars. He gradually established his strategy, his networks, and his men to hold the USSR in an iron grip. Stalin had rid himself of any opposition, and from then on, his aim was to industrialize the country as quickly as possible so that it could defend itself if there were another war. In a few years, Stalin would completely change the face of the Soviet Union. He built the Moscow Underground, constructed new towns, dug canals, and erected dams. It was all part of the edification of socialism. The aura he constructed around the Soviet Union was greeted enthusiastically by most communist parties in Western Europe, in particular in Italy and France.
Nous avons la volonté d'aller plus loin, jusqu'à la République française des Soviets, que nous ferons triompher sous le drapeau de l'international communiste, sous la bannière invincible de Marx, Engels, Lénine, Staline. Nous savons que la bataille sera rude, mais nous sommes sûrs de la victoire. Et nous ne craignons pas, à l'appel de Dimitrov, d'affronter les flots tumultueux, car à la barre de notre navire est entre les mains fermes du plus grand des pilotes, de notre cher et grand Staline.
No secretary of a communist party at that time, from the early 1930s, could be appointed without Moscow's agreement. So it was either Stalin who personally oversaw it or his secretariat. And they usually chose these secretaries very carefully, someone about whom they had some compromising information they could use against them.
Stalin became a hero for communists the world over. Moscow was a synonym for the Promised Land. Empowered by his strength and his success, Stalin had joined the big league, and his portrait now hung beside those of Lenin, Marx, and Engels. But in order to have absolute power, he had to get rid of anyone who in any way would cast a shadow over him. Once again, Comrade Stalin pulled off a Machiavellian coup. He took advantage of the assassination of Kirov, a key member of the Politburo, who was executed in shady circumstances, to launch the systematic elimination of every enemy and to set in motion a reign of terror.
As soon as he had the information, he immediately understood the political advantages he would be able to gain from this assassination. He headed off in his special train to St. Petersburg, or Leningrad as it was called at the time. He tidied things up, got rid of the witnesses who might have contradicted his version, and said that Kirov was assassinated by traitors of the party, and that Zinoviev was responsible. And so was Kamenev, and above them it was Trotsky. That allowed him to order the assassination of party members, which until that point had been virtually unthinkable. And from then on, obviously, it took on huge proportions.
As with Lenin's succession, Stalin proceeded in a very methodical manner. His strategy began with a huge propaganda campaign that went far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. In 1933, Hitler came to power in Germany. For communists around the world, the Führer became the #1 enemy. Stalin didn't hesitate to draw comparisons between Trotsky and the Chancellor of the Third Reich.
The anti-Trotsky propaganda was extremely violent. For example, the French Communist Party published a brochure, an anti-Doriot brochure, with Doriot behind a Trotsky mask or a Hitler mask, etc. You can imagine during the height of the Popular Front, if you associated Hitler with Trotskyites and said they were Hitler's allies, the people were petrified. You couldn't support Trotsky, that would be unthinkable. So Stalin set an extraordinary propaganda steamroller in motion, in Vietnam as well, and China, everywhere. During the years 1933 to 1936, if a communist came across a Trotskyite, they would attack them and liquidate them, if necessary, physically.
Stalin gradually managed to discredit the men who embodied the party's old guard or who showed any kind of loyalty to Trotsky. The second phase of their elimination was carried out through 3 trials held in Moscow between August 1936 and March 1938. Stalin had constructed the cases against the defendants in minute detail. He ordered the agents of the NKVD, his political law enforcement agency, to extract confessions from the old Bolsheviks. During their public examinations, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, among others, had to endure the haranguing and insults of prosecutor Vyshinsky, a close ally of Stalin's.
Требует наш народ одного: раздавите проклятую гадину.
We now know that these trials were totally rigged. Totally rigged. They were complete fiction. The accused learned their parts, the prosecutor learned his, and they gave a performance. It was very well done. Because, as you know, when you're dealing with terror, you can get people to do exactly what you want.
There are awful stories of them saying to the accused, "Did you place nails in the butter of the people?" And these intelligent men, these great intellectuals, would reply, "Yes, we placed nails in the butter of the people." "And did you put nails in the eggs of the people?" And these brilliant men would reply, "No, we couldn't because they had shells." The Foreign Press Corps was at the trials and thought it was completely normal.
Trotsky was also condemned to death in absentia, and he knew that Stalin had no intention of leaving the punishment undelivered.
These trials developed not from communism, not from socialism, but from Stalinism, that is, from the irresponsible despotism of the bureaucracy over the people. What is now my principal task? To reveal the truth, to show and to demonstrate that the true criminals hide under the cloak of the accusers.
But Trotsky's protests counted for little in the face of the Stalinist machine crushing everything in its path. All Trotsky's books, all the works in which Trotsky appeared as a hero of the revolution, were removed from libraries until the image of the founder of the Red Army had been completely erased.
And there is that famous photo that has been retouched of one of Lenin's speeches on an open-air stage. And there's a little staircase up to the stage. And Trotsky is on the staircase. Then one day, he disappears. There's nobody on the staircase. And everything was like that. That was typical of Stalin's methods, the retouching of photographs.
Those photos weren't intended to trick the old Bolsheviks, to trick the heads of the party. They were there to send a message. And the message was, don't talk about these people anymore. Now, talking about so-and-so and talking about Trotsky in particular is not only punishable, but can be dangerous for you.
After Turkey, Trotsky was given asylum in France and then in Norway. But gradually, he became undesirable right across Europe. No leader wanted to risk offending Stalin by welcoming Trotsky to their country. Only Mexico agreed to take him in. Trotsky arrived in Mexico City in January 1937. He and his wife Natalia were put up by Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. These two Mexican painters and militant communists agreed to welcome them. Trotsky still hoped to unify the partisans behind him. He created a new organization, the Fourth International. He also set up a commission to pull apart the accusations of the Moscow trials. But even thousands of miles away from the Soviet Union, Trotsky could feel the noose tightening around his neck. In 1938, he learned of the death of his son, Leon Sedov. He had undergone surgery in Paris for a simple case of appendicitis, but Sedov died on the operating table. For Trotsky, how he died left no room for doubt. Stalin had assassinated his son. And now he was next on the list.
He retreated into his bedroom for several days with Natalia. He took a little tea, and then afterwards he emerged. He had aged a great deal during those days of mourning. Often when the secretaries, the comrades and the guards talked to me, he would tell them, "Don't talk politics with my grandson." He wanted to keep me away from all that. His whole family had succumbed, perished as part of that struggle. So with me, he wanted his grandson to survive. And he succeeded. Nobody else in my family lived to be 88, as I am now.
But Trotsky could still be a threat to Stalin. At least that's what the head of the Kremlin feared. In 1939, Stalin, who just a few years previously had denounced the Hitler-Trotskyites, signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler's Germany, to general amazement. He wanted to give himself time to fight the Nazis, but he knew his strategy hadn't been understood by a good number of militant communists around the world.
Hostility towards the German-Soviet pact ran deep. Everyone towed the line to a certain extent, but if they could get out of this unlikely alliance with Hitler, they would all have been in agreement. Trotsky was a known quantity. He was credible. He had that revolutionary prestige. He'd never negotiated with Stalin since he'd been exiled. And just imagine if he'd clearly and determinedly taken up a position, calling on all militant communists to bury their differences and reject the German-Soviet pact.
Despite being politically defeated and condemned to exile, Trotsky was still a danger to Stalin. By 1939, his physical elimination had become a priority. On the 24th of May 1940, around 20 men dressed as Mexican police entered Leon Trotsky's house. Armed with machine guns, they fired into the bedroom where he was sleeping with his wife, Natalia. Esteban, Trotsky's grandson, woke with a start in the neighboring room.
My grandfather was half asleep because he used to take sleeping pills. Natalia quickly dragged him out of bed and pushed him into a corner, the southeastern corner of the bedroom, under the table. And that's what saved his life.
Miraculously, Leon Trotsky and Natalia were spared. The investigation showed that Siqueiros, a member of the Mexican Communist Party and a fervent partisan of Stalin, had led the attack. He and his accomplices were arrested, but quickly released due to a lack of evidence. In the days following the attack, security at the house was improved. Bulletproof doors were installed along with an electric fence and an alarm system. But Trotsky knew that the attack of the 24th of May was just a dress rehearsal. The next time, it would succeed. That's when Ramon Mercader entered the scene. This young Spanish communist, an agent of the Soviet secret services who went by the names Jacques Mornard and Frank Jackson, had been plotting to assassinate Trotsky for months. First, he seduced a young militant by the name of Sylvia Agaloff. She introduced him into Trotsky's household. Ramon Mercader gradually became a familiar figure.
Sometimes he'd take us out for a drive through the Mexican countryside. Yes, he'd give us gifts too.
Trotsky was so isolated in his lockdown Mexican house. He saw this young guy turn up. He seemed to be Belgian or maybe Canadian. Nobody really knows anymore, and it doesn't really matter. But he was a great admirer of Leon Trotsky. I don't really know much about politics, but I'd love to learn. And I'd really like to try writing an article in support of you. And there you have it.
On the 20th of August 1940, Ramon Mercader said he wanted to show Trotsky an article he had written. Trotsky was sitting at his desk. When he leant over to read it, Mercader grabbed the icepick he'd been hiding in his raincoat and plunged it deep into Trotsky's skull. Then Esteban, Trotsky's grandson, who was 13 at the time, was coming home from school.
Immediately I felt this anguish that something terrible had happened. So I hurried home. I went into the garden and immediately bumped into one of the guards. And through the half-open door I could see my grandfather lying there on the wooden floor, covered in blood, with Natalia and the guards. And when grandfather heard me coming, he said to the guards, "Get Esteban away from here. My grandson mustn't see this." And at the same time, he said to the guards, when he heard the moans of his killer, "Don't kill him, he has to speak."
N'allez pas le tuer, il doit parler.
Trotsky was immediately taken to hospital. He died from his wounds the following day. 300,000 people attended his funeral in Mexico. Before he died, he spoke the following words: "Tell our friends, I'm certain of the victory of the Fourth International." Ramon Mercader was sentenced to 20 years in prison. When he returned to Moscow in the 1960s, he was greeted as a hero of the Soviet Union. Trotsky went down in history as the thwarted heir, the man of a different communism. But his death also bears testimony to the power of Stalin, capable of murdering an enemy thousands of miles away from Moscow. Killing him politically wasn't enough. The Tsar had to slay the prophet. After Hitler broke the German-Soviet pact in 1941, Stalin fought an epic fight against Nazi Germany to stake his place as one of the great post-war victors. Right up there with Churchill and Roosevelt. Stalin had not only vanquished Trotsky, but he had carved out a definitive place for himself in history.